So welcome to this panel session entitled "A Lie Can Travel, Election Disinformation in the United States, Brazil, and France," which is drawing from an excellent report that has just come out looking at 3 case studies, and it's definitely worth a read if you haven't had a chance yet. I'm honored to be the moderator here today. I'm Alicia Wamlis, Director of the Partnership for Countering Influence Operations at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. This event is hosted by the Center for Democracy and Technology and Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, or KAS. KAS is a foundation headquartered in Germany with offices in more than 120 countries. KAS offers a wide variety of civic education conferences and events which aim at promoting freedom, liberty, peace, and justice. KAS focuses on democratic consolidation, the unification of Europe, the strengthening of transatlantic relations, and development cooperation. The statements expressed during this event are solely those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of KAS or its employees. The chat is open. Q&A is also open, so please do submit your questions. We will be tracking those. Portuguese interpretation is available, and Paulo will be speaking in Portuguese. So if you need the translation, please turn the English interpretation on by clicking the globe interpretation button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Paulo.
Oi, bom dia pessoal. Então, para os que falam português, a gente tem uma tradução simultânea disponível para quem quiser ouvir a tradução para português. Para ouvir no computador, clica no globinho de interpretação na barra inferior do Zoom e escolha português. Se você está usando celular ou tablet, clica nas reticências ou em More ou mais e escolhe o botão de interpretação de idiomas, clicando em português e depois OK. Muito obrigado e bom debate para todo mundo.
Obrigada. Around the table, we have 4 great speakers today. The first will be William T. Adler, who is the Senior Election Technologist at the Center for Democracy and Technology, where he works to ensure that American elections are fair, accessible, and secure. That's a tall order. Paulo José Lara is Head of Digital Rights at Article 19 Brazil and South America. He's a sociologist and a political scientist, and he's lectured in schools and universities in cultural studies, geopolitics, and communication. Jean-Baptiste Jean-Jean Villemin is director of the Institute for Strategic Research at the French Ministry of the Armed Forces and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. He is the author of several reports on hybrid threats and information manipulation. And last but not least, Kate Starbird is an associate professor at the University of Washington, where she is co-founder and current faculty director of the Center for an Informed Public. Her research examines the production and spread of online rumors, misinformation, and disinformation during crises, and the participatory nature of online disinformation campaigns. Welcome, all of you. I think the first question I'd like to put out for each of you is, what was the most surprising or alarming finding for you in conducting this research and reading the report? Will, would you like to go first?
Sure, yeah, and I just want to start by thanking KAS for their support with this project, Paulo and Jean-Baptiste for being such great co-authors on this report, Kate for joining this panel and also conducting some of the research that was really fundamental for this report, and of course, Alicia for moderating this. So when we were putting this report together, we were thinking about the lasting impact of election disinformation, particularly in response to the 2020 US election. So the violence of January 6th, efforts to restrict voting, threats against election workers, the weaponization of post-election audits, and other mechanisms that should be used to increase trust in elections rather than decrease it. But we knew that the US wasn't the only country where the population was being bombarded with lies about our election system. So we wanted to know how this was playing out elsewhere in the world, what other countries have done, and what we can learn from each other. And in putting the report together, the thing that alarms me most about election disinformation is the speed at which it can take hold. So a video or a photo with a misleading caption can get out there. It can be seen hundreds of thousands of times. It can have a huge impact. Fact checkers can get to work on it, but by the time a correction goes out, the instigators have moved on to another narrative, quickly constructing what researchers like Kate are calling a meta narrative about, for instance, a broad scheme to rig an election. So this speed and that at which these lies can spread is one reason why we named the report after this Jonathan Swift quote that's often misattributed to Mark Twain: "A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes." But yesterday, I was actually informed that this is actually a paraphrasal of a much better Jonathan Swift passage from 1710, which I want to share because it's so relevant. So that passage goes, "If a lie be believed only for an hour, it has done its work, and there is no farther occasion for it. Falsehood flies, and the truth comes limping after it, so that when men come to be undeceived, it is too late. The jest is over, and the tale has had its effect." So that was 300 years ago. So even before the internet, the speed and the power of lies has plagued society, and the seeming inability of the truth to catch up with it and knock it down. So, this seemingly fundamental fact about disinformation, its speed, shows the need for really strong rapid response efforts, but also underscores the importance of the really long-term work of building more resilient societies, increasing media literacy, increasing civic literacy, which you can think of these as sort of the vaccines for disinformation.
Thanks. That's such a great quote. And I mean, disinformation, even Thucydides was bemoaning what people would believe about Sparta way back when in the Peloponnesian War. Paolo, what did you find most surprising in conducting this research?
Thank you, Alicia. Thanks, everyone, for the amazing job with this report. And I would like to thank also Rafaela and a lot of from my team who helped us out in co-authoring the piece. I'll switch to Portuguese right now, and I think you can have the translation by the amazing Paulas and Julia's team. Então, acho que uma coisa importante, e aí indo na mesma direção do Will, que a gente não tanto descobriu, mas a gente se certificou, a relação da desinformação em face à ciência, à tecnologia e o conhecimento, né? Costuma-se dizer que a melhor maneira de combater a desinformação é com mais informação. E isso sim é importante, faz sentido, mas a gente tem que entender que há hoje em dia um descrédito da mídia tradicional, por exemplo, também das agências de checagem de fatos. Então, a missão de combate à desinformação ela é mais complexa do que soa essa afirmação de que ela se combate com mais informação. Há uma necessidade, como a gente viu no caso do Brasil, de que se observe que há necessidade de expansão a longo prazo, a médio e longo prazo, de conhecimentos técnicos, científicos e acadêmicos sobre os temas que envolvem os tópicos dessas campanhas de desinformação. No caso do Brasil, onde a gente trabalhou muito mais com a questão do descrédito das eleições e das urnas eletrônicas, isso se torna muito mais notável, né? Então, a estratégia de se juntar o interesse político para engajar uma determinada parcela da população, como, por exemplo, quando há necessidade de se engajar uma parte mais conservadora e religiosa do eleitorado com ataques e menções a políticas de igualdade de gênero, de não discriminação da população LGBT, e isso agrada uma parcela conservadora e religiosa, há também uma necessidade, uma estratégia de se trabalhar campanhas de desinformação com temas que não são simples, são complexos e que nos fazem parecer simples por conta do ambiente da internet, que tem muito a ver com ambientes jurídicos, ambientes políticos e institucionais. Nisso eu acho que o caso que a gente trabalhou, que foi né, de maneira mais intensa ao caso das urnas eletrônicas, mostra que o combate à desinformação é necessário, a desinformação pode atingir níveis dramáticos ao ponto de deteriorar eleições e processos democráticos, mas há também a necessidade de um pensamento a longo prazo para que haja a difusão do conhecimento, de técnicas, de ciência, de tecnologia, para que isso seja pensado também como um papel da sociedade e fazer com que determinadas campanhas não façam que a desinformação e que os elementos montados por esses grupos organizados de desinformação sejam críveis. Dessa maneira, para terminar, dos elementos que saltou aos olhos nisso é essa necessidade de uma intensificação do conhecimento técnico, da ciência e da tecnologia, e nos faz entender um pouco também do porquê esses grupos que promovem desinformação também atacam de maneira muito forte a pesquisa jornalística, a investigação, o trabalho acadêmico. Então, acho que isso ficou muito claro nesse panorama que a gente conseguiu fazer sobre a desinformação, sobre as urnas eletrônicas e o processo eleitoral.
And that's so important too. And how do you make the information more engaging that people will actually want it, as opposed to going after the disinformation that's out there? Thank you for that. Jean-Baptiste, what did you find the most alarming in this work?
Thank you, Kate. Good morning, everyone. And I'd like to also take this opportunity to thank Will and Dana-Raj, with whom it was really great to work on this report. So I'd say quite paradoxically that for me, the most surprising finding was the fact that there's actually not much to say about France. That's exactly what Will and Dana-Raj wrote in their executive summary when they explain that election disinformation has been widespread in the US and Brazil, but relatively peripheral in France. And it's true. So to be clear, I'm not saying that we don't have a major problem with disinformation today in France. We do have. But my point is that there's nothing specific about elections. My point is that disinformation increases with major social events, and those major social events, it can be elections. And for us, the only significant case we had was the Macron leaks operation during the 2017 presidential election. But those major social events, they can also be protest movements, for example, like the Yellow Vest movement a couple of years ago, or today the anti-vax movement. And I would say that the level of disinformation that we see during those movements rival what we saw during the previous election. So again, there's nothing really specific to elections. So why isn't election disinfo such a huge issue in France? I think it's probably linked to some institutional differences, to the fact that elections in France are prepared and executed by very centralized and independent administrative authorities. And you'll find in the report several of them mentioned, but the important one is the National Commission for the Control of the Electoral Campaign for the Presidential Election. It's a long acronym, it's CNCCEP. And they monitor and they intervene against disinformation during the campaign. Also, a new national agency has been recently created. Its name is Vigilum. Vigilum stands for Vigilance and Protection Service Against Digital Interference. And it's quite new, it's operational since September. And its role is precisely to monitor, detect, and characterize foreign digital interference operations, aiming at manipulating information on social networks, and to provide any useful information to the National Commission and the Media Regulatory Authority, which is called the CSA in France. Now, it's no coincidence that such a new agency has been created recently, because as you know, we are at the beginning at the moment of a presidential campaign. There will be a presidential election in France in April. And one of the main tasks of this new agency, Vigilum, will be to actually monitor and detect any election disinformation during this period of time. So I would say, even though we didn't see much in the past, except in 2017, the next 4 months should be particularly interesting.
Thank you. And I had to say, in reading the paper and hearing how France's electoral system is structured and protected, I wonder how many of the American readers are reading that with a little bit of envy, that may be a little bit better there adopted if they could. Kate, I'll rephrase this question for you a little bit, mostly given our previous conversation about things not being surprising anymore. But in reading this paper, what do you find the most alarming in its findings?
I mean, just as I'm not surprised, I'm also no longer alarmed, because everything's alarming. And so it does seem, just to more signals of similar things. I also thought it was interesting that the information on the French context, and that disinformation in France, they haven't seen the kinds of things that we've been seeing in the US and Brazil. I certainly know the US case much better than I do the other cases. The thing that is, I guess, interesting, perhaps not surprising, perhaps not alarming, but maybe it should be, is how in the US and Brazil cases, the same narratives are moving across those different cases. In fact, things we saw in the US in 2020, perhaps not for the first time, but for the first time in such large amounts, Brazil was seeing that in 2018. And in fact, there's this, someone said, oh, there's, contagion. Well, it's not contagion. It's actually, in some cases, the same people are working and spreading the same kinds of things in both places. There are, not to say that it's coordinated, but there are networks of folks in the US, in Brazil, particularly related to our former president, Donald Trump, and I think the current president of Brazil, Bolsonaro, they've shared ideologies and they share tactics, and undermining trust in election systems is one of those tactics. And we can see it in our data. We can actually see in the US social media data around election disinformation in 2020, we can see the Bolsonaros, some of the sons of the president there, spreading this content, the same kind of content that we see the sons of Donald Trump spreading around, trying to sow distrust in the election processes. So for me, like, the integration is really interesting and troubling, and speaks to more. So it's not, we talk about, foreign versus domestic campaigns. So in the US in 2016, we really problematized the foreign interference in our election. In 2020, it was certainly domestic, but it's actually hard to even separate those now, because there's networks of folks who understand how to share tactics, who, they're connected in ways we can see and in ways we can't see. And certainly, if we're seeing it in two contexts, we can see it in more. And I think we're going to see these same kinds of narratives and meta narratives moving to other democracies where somebody doesn't think they're going to like the outcome of an election, and they're able to sort of steal the population against that. And I think it's a danger for democracy going forward. So that, it's alarming. As a researcher, it's interesting. It's like, oh, there's patterns here. But as a member of a democratic society, it's kind of alarming to see how that sharing of tactics is moving across contexts.
And I mean, this is something that we've talked about quite a bit, about the concept of the information environment, how it's a system, how things are integrated, and yet we're not really moving towards looking at that. So finding those patterns and being able to articulate that is super helpful. One of the lessons learned in this study was that, and I quote, government officials must commit to not traffic in disinformation and to take seriously their role in countering objectively false information about voting processes. In the last US presidential election, though, it seemed that only Elizabeth Warren was the single candidate to commit to not using disinformation in her campaign. And there's some other individual voluntary efforts like that of Congresswoman Lori Tron, who's now published her own social media data library to offer transparency on her campaign. Of course, these are all voluntary, and I can't help in reading the paper not wonder how we might better rein politicians in. Will, do you have any thoughts on how politicians might be held better to account?
Yeah, this is an incredibly important problem, and incredibly difficult also. So, in thinking about why election disinformation might not have been such an issue in France, Jean-Baptiste said one reason might be the centralization of the way that elections are administered in France, which, the decentralization of elections in the US is definitely a problem, but it's clearly not the whole enchilada, right? Because Brazil also has a highly centralized election system and a very professional electoral court that administers elections. And they're still, as Kate discussed, seeing some of the same exact narratives, right? And of course, the elephant in the room is the leadership, right? When you have the leaders of countries who are willing to undermine the very system by which they were elected, and they have a political incentive to do so, it's very challenging to fight. So, the norms that you just described, or the commitments, the voluntary commitments that you described some politicians making, these are all really important, and norms of transparency and norms of not trafficking in disinformation are really important, right? There's in the US, there's been, there's some requirements about campaign finance disclosures. There are norms about other aspects of campaign finance. There are norms of transparency about taxes, for instance. And of course, it has an effect that those norms are in place, and it has an effect when candidates violate those norms, but of course they're free to violate those norms if they see an incentive to do so. So I think that it's important, but of course it's not going to get us all the way there. One way to decrease politicians spreading disinformation is just making it less powerful, right? This is sort of a game about the margins. How effective is this disinformation? Because as long as it's effective, people are going to find ways to use it. So we need to inoculate the population, need to improve our rapid response, all these kinds of things to make it less of a powerful strategy to the extent that that's possible. And then the last thing is content moderation. So content moderation can range from labeling content to removing content all the way to suspending accounts or suspending networks of accounts, which of course Facebook and Twitter did in response to January 6th. There used to be, the platforms used to cite, and maybe to a certain extent they still do cite, the argument that speech from politicians is inherently newsworthy and should be left up. There's been some movement away from this when that speech has I think that as a society, we're recognizing that that speech can sometimes lead to violence, which is part of the calculation that Facebook and Twitter cite in the decision to suspend Donald Trump after January 6th. There's a calculation that, okay, there's an issue here of, yeah, people should be able to hear from their leaders, but the speech from these leaders has outsized impact, outsized influence, and the ability to cause harm and violence. So, so account suspensions may well be an appropriate enforcement action on many online services. We think it's important that platforms are transparent about how they make these decisions, how they evaluate the risk that a speaker's speech could lead to violence. What is the context for these remarks? And does this approach scale to all users, regardless of whether they're politicians or not? Why was this account banned? We think users should have ample notice of that kind of thing. Is it indefinite? Is there something that a speaker can do to get their account back? It's something that applies both to politicians, but also the general public.
Thanks. Well, I'd be interested to hear your perspective too, given that you're coming from and studying a country that where the leading politician is spreading disinformation to undermine trust in an election system that actually seems to be the most secure it's ever been in history. How would you rein in politicians, and also what generally has been the role of, like, just using more technology put us more at risk? Like, what's the connection between politicians and undermining technology?
É interessante essa pergunta. Eu acho que tem uma coisa importante da gente fazer, que é não coisificar a desinformação, né? Não reificá-la, não compreendê-la como algo isolado de um contexto maior. As eleições, elas são, antes de mais nada, um pacto social, e elas aparecem de diferentes maneiras, em diferentes contextos, em diferentes países. Então, casos, por exemplo, de votos pelo correio, votos além-mar de países, podem ser entendidos por uma sociedade como legítimos e não causar problema. Da mesma maneira como, e a Alicia muito bem mencionou, o sistema eleitoral brasileiro, que se utiliza de urnas eletrônicas relativamente seguras né, num período histórico onde há o menor número de acusações e verificações de fraude, isso também pode ser abalado, porque, afinal de contas, não é a tecnologia em si, mas o pacto social que corre em torno do processo eleitoral. Dessa maneira, enfim, a gente tem um histórico passado de interferências de países em votações em suas colônias, por exemplo. Na França, os Estados Unidos sempre interferiram em eleições, enfim, você sempre houve isso. A coisa dos agentes internos e agentes externos também fazem parte de um contexto político e geopolítico e que a gente viu se radicalizar nos últimos anos. E aí, nesse sentido, acho que é importante que as legislações, e são muitas em debate, e no Brasil particularmente, mas creio que no mundo inteiro, tenham um olhar especial, sim, para a responsabilização de agentes públicos e autoridades. E, nesse sentido, o papel que determinadas autoridades têm no debate público tem que ser responsabilizado quando ficar caracterizado que há uma intencionalidade de proliferar desinformação. Isso é muito importante. Mas, ao mesmo tempo, a gente tem que entender que esses processos tecnológicos todos, né, o advento da internet e essa facilidade, essa ilusão de que as pessoas têm mais e melhores informações por causa da velocidade que essas informações chegam, acho que a gente precisa entender também que o sistema integrado de poder político e poder econômico envolve, sim, grandes meios de comunicação, grandes empresas, o poder político regional, etc. Então, enquanto aquilo, voltando ao que eu falei no começo, enquanto um pacto social, isso precisa ser tratado de maneira de políticas públicas e de fomento a esse conhecimento, além de legislações específicas que responsabilizem autoridades que têm no debate público um poder maior e uma capacidade de influenciar grande parte da população que pode, nesse sentido, ser prejudicial à democracia e aos processos eleitorais.
Thank you. This will be for Jean-Baptiste. In comparing the different interventions across 3 countries, does anything stand out to you? Is there a difference in how platforms approach each country? Are there lessons that could be learned from one to the other?
Well, I'd say certainly one of the important lessons is the importance of civil society interventions. I think we should really highlight that aspect. It's very important to have, even as states, to have civil society-oriented approaches of fighting disinformation, because disinformation feeds on declining trust in government and in anything that seems related to the state. So it makes it very difficult for the state. It can even be very counterproductive for the state to actually fight disinformation efficiently. And it seems to me that the most interesting initiatives in all 3 countries are coming from civil society, from the journalists, the researchers, the NGOs, the think tanks, etc. And you mentioned previously that maybe in the US you would look at France with envy. I'm not sure, because there is still a lack of major civil society actors in France. We are very state-centered for obvious historical and institutional reasons. But I'm thinking especially about think tanks like CDT, but also like the DFR lab at the Atlantic Council that you have in the US, or private companies like Graphica. You have in the US major civil society actors that are able to monitor, to detect, and also to expose, which is very important, to expose disinformation, to name and shame. And we don't have the equivalent in France yet. And ironically, when I mentioned the creation of Vigilance, the new state agency to fight foreign digital interference, one problem being that it's only focused on foreign interference. And as you said earlier as well, a main challenge is to distinguish between what's foreign and what's domestic. So it can be a problem. But when that agency was created, someone said that it was about creating a state Graphica. The model was Graphica in the US. But so I'm not saying that Vigilance is not useful. My point is that it's simply not the same thing. And the whole point of Graphica or DFR Lab is precisely that they're not the state. They are distinct from the state. And because we are still very much state-centered in France, which is not surprising for the reasons I mentioned, I think there's still a lack of major civil society actors, and that would be, for me at least at the national level, one of the main lessons from I take from the comparison between the 3 cases.
And then that's such an important point. I mean, we'd found 460 initiatives working in this space before in last year, and the vast majority of them are in nonprofit organizations, which is particularly challenging given some of the funding constraints being project-based and not operationally based. And that actually is going to lead into another question for Kate. We hear this term whole of society solutions to counter disinformation all the time, but what does this mean in practice? Just looking at the paper, it mentions, again, I quote, collaborations between governments, academics, social media platforms, journalists, election officials, and civil society to monitor and mitigate election disinformation as the most promising method to counter disinformation. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that means in practice with your experience from the Election Integrity Partnership, but also how might this be approached globally? Because we need to be able to do this at scale too.
It's such a fascinating question, and to give a little context there, the paper cites a couple of times this project collaboration, network of collaborating partners. I'm not even sure what we've called it, except for we gave it the term election integrity partnership, that my team at the University of Washington was involved with, where we were collaborating with another research team at Stanford, as well as with the DFR lab and Graphica. Along with a set of multi-stakeholder partners in civil society. We also had with journalists, we had some community organizations, and we also were collaborating in some ways with the platforms and government, in the sense that we were taking the outputs of what we were doing and letting them know. And what we were doing was what we called rapid response to disinformation related to the election, where we were trying to rapidly identify, analyze, and communicate about different kinds of informational threats to election integrity. We started that in August of 2020 and had to unfortunately ramp down in the middle of December. We wish we would have been able to take it forward into January and beyond. But we did this sort of shift work with hundreds of research. I think we had 120 researchers total across the 4 organizations that were working, trying to cover almost 24/7 monitoring mis and disinformation. We just had our a post project meetup just last week, so a lot of this is fresh in our mind to kind of think about what went right, how that worked, how it might work in the future. One of the things that we couldn't necessarily all of us see, because it was so collaborative, is that we were having impact at the government level in the sense that there were folks that were taking our outputs and using that to pressure the platforms to say, hey, you need to do better on these things. But also, at the end of the day, there was an organization within the U.S. government, within the Trump administration, that stood firm and said, these claims are not true. These are lies. It was called rumor control within the cybersecurity office in the DHS, which is our Department of Homeland Security. But in any case, they stood firm against the president's lies, which was a really powerful thing that was able to, we hope, maybe have had an impact on others kind of standing against what they tried to do leading up to January 6th. And so there's really this value. And again, the government wasn't doing the analysis. They can't, the United States, they can't look at social media data. They can't do the kinds of analyses we could do. And they weren't telling us what to look at, but we were able to take the products of what we were doing and let election officials know, hey, there's a threat. Someone's claiming, that the Sharpies aren't working or whatever. I think Maricopa County already knew that claim was out there, but we were able to let folks know that there were certain informational threats in their areas. And so how does that work for others? I think it's really hard. I think you have to have local groups that understand what's going on, but they also have to be able to connect with experts who are able to do the analyses. And it's non-trivial. It takes, it takes a lot of infrastructure, data infrastructure. It takes a lot of expertise, methodological expertise, contextual expertise. But we're trying to think about how we build out frameworks that others can adopt and use in their own contexts, possibly through collaboration, but possibly empowering others in other contexts to be able to kind of set up these collaborations as a set of of tools and processes and sort of mapping out the organizational process. It's very complicated, but we did it ad hoc last time. We're going to do it again for election 2022 in the United States, and hope to help others do it in other places as well. So I'm really excited about that process, and happy to see it cited in the report, to know that we were able to have an impact on how people understand, in particular, the disinformation in the U.S. Election in 2020.
It really has had rave reviews. Everybody I've talked to has said really good things about the EIP. Will, with a decentralized electoral system like the United States, how is it even possible to really coordinate a response? I mean, one thing that stood out to me as being kind of, well, there's many things in the paper, as being shocking, was that the election officials are so underfunded that private funding was needed to support them. How do you overcome that kind of a mess?
Yeah, it's really tough. It's a huge factor. Like I said, it's not the only factor, because there's still election disinformation in Brazil, where it's very centralized. But Yeah, I think our international audience might be surprised to know that in the US, there's no uniform set of rules for elections. There are some very minimum standards. The 55 states and territories all have different rules. Elections are then implemented by about 8,000 or 9,000 different jurisdictions, which could all have different procedures, different machines. These range in registered voters from a few thousand in rural counties to about 5 million in LA County. So huge heterogeneity across the US and how elections are run, which can lead to election disinformation in a few ways. So one is it's hard to convey the truth of how elections work. People might not know it in the first place, right? If you read something about how something is done in Pennsylvania and you don't live in Pennsylvania, it might sound crazy to you because it sounds different from how you voted in your state or in your county. It might also be hard for journalists to fact check a claim about election administration in a obscure jurisdiction. But another one is, like you said, election administrators are stretched really thin. They're horribly underfunded. They had to depend on private money, private donations in 2020, which in response, legislators in many states actually changed the laws to bar election officials from allowing private donations, while of course, it'd be one thing if they did that while increasing election funding to the extent that they needed, but they often did not do that. So yeah, election officials are stretched thin. They run very small offices. They often don't have a full-time IT person, which can create security problems. They often don't have a full-time communications person. Even at the state level, the Secretary of State, who's usually the chief election official, does not always have a strong communications team. So when they're thrust into this communications role by a disinformation campaign that targets them, they don't always have the sway or the reach or the ability to counter one of these narratives, which is why this kind of whole of society approach, having them contribute to the extent they are able, right, providing the information about how elections are run while allowing the platforms and journalists to try to get the message out and try to figure out how to respond is so critical. And they're often hamstrung by states in other ways. So for instance, in 2020, because of COVID, there was a huge increase in the number of absentee ballots that were submitted. And many of these jurisdictions and whole states were not allowed by law to actually count the ballots in advance, which led to this extended period of time between about 3 or 4 days, or it was more than that, between the election and when the election was called, which was a period when everyone was entirely focused on how the election was going to turn out. It was basically the only thing on cable news for days, but there was no information, right? If you watched cable news, you'd see these anchors be like, oh, we've got 100 more votes in this county in Nevada. But that creates an interest and a demand for narratives, right? And narratives emerged in that period that persist to this day. So I think we really need to give election officials the resources which can include money and staffing, but also time to actually run elections in a good way. And one thing that Matt Masterson, who has been an election official at the state level and was also at the cybersecurity agency, has said is that one thing that needs to happen is there needs to be a unified communication strategy, focus on the things that are consistent across the country, right? Even though elections are administered so differently in each jurisdiction, when you talk about why we should trust elections, you talk about, a set of themes, right? So for instance, elections are transparent. You can see how they're run. Elections are run on a bipartisan basis. You need both a Democrat and a Republican to transport ballots from a drop box to an office, for instance. And third, they're run by professionals. So if you just focus on the things that are constant, and that's the narrative that is repeated about election officials, that's maybe one way to get around the issue of like the fact that things are run so differently in each country.
Excellent. Okay, we're gonna move to audience questions now. We'll start with one for you, Paulo, and maybe Kate. Are there any plans to replicate the model of the election integrity partnership in Brazil next year? That's from Dan Arnado.
Not that I'm aware of, but I'll handle to Kate if she wants to jump in. But I do. It will be quite interesting, but not sure, not heard about it. But I'm open to think and research if there's any.
Well, Paulo,
Kate, I feel like
there are some
something we should do.
The TSE does have some sort of collaborations with civil society and journalists and the platforms, right?
Yes, what I can, oh, sorry, let me go to Portuguese just to say that quickly. Existem, sim, medidas em função das recentes ameaças à integridade do sistema eleitoral, medidas gradativas de abertura do Tribunal Superior Eleitoral para participação e para transparência no sentido de maior intervenção de especialistas da sociedade civil. Nós, da Artigo 19, somos parte do Observatório da Transparência Eleitoral, que é um dos 2 organismos criados pelo TSE. E o que a gente vem colocando para as autoridades eleitorais brasileiras é que uma coisa que precisa ficar muito clara nesse segmento é aonde o Tribunal Superior e as autoridades eleitorais querem chegar, onde está esse caminho das pedras, esse roadmap, para que haja maior transparência, maior abertura e aquilo que o Will estava dizendo, assim, princípios comuns, básicos, de compreensão da população para fazer com que esse pacto social eleitoral aconteça. Agora, e a última coisa, um dos pontos positivos de todo esse debate sobre paper trail, voto em papel e urnas eletrônicas, foi fazer com que haja um engajamento, ainda que superficial. Primeiro, demonstrou uma falta de conhecimento tanto da esquerda como da direita sobre como realmente se dá o processo e todo essa comoção fez com que as pessoas se debruçassem um pouco mais sobre os complexos problemas da infraestrutura eleitoral. Então, isso é positivo e permite com que as autoridades eleitorais, a sociedade civil e as partes interessadas possam planejar e debater. Isso eu espero que aconteça. O tribunal tem mostrado inclinações nesse sentido, mas como eu falei no começo, é super importante que haja um trabalho muito mais de base para que esses fenômenos sejam compreendidos, sejam eles de logística até da tecnologia utilizada, mas, enfim, essas são as principais linhas que estão se delineando no Brasil para as próximas eleições, pelo menos para 2022 e depois para 2026.
Thanks. I think I'll combine 2 questions, one from fellow Canuck Tim Abre and another from Camille Taylor. And I'll throw this one to you, Jean-Baptiste. How do we empower citizens to better assess information and build more resiliency and informed end users of information and media outputs? And then to that end, is it enough to be using media literacy? Should we be looking at further regulations to stop the flow of deliberately misleading or destabilizing disinformation campaigns? Jean-Baptiste, would you like to?
Yes. So media literacy is certainly necessary, I believe, but not enough. And it's necessary, and it should be understood not only as teaching kids, but also adults. And most of the time, unfortunately, when we talk about media literacy or media education, we refer to schools, and we forget that actually the senior people are the other part of the population that is spreading the most fake news. So we need to find ways to educate that segment of the senior population as well. It can be done through various trainings of civil servants, for example. And a good example of that would not be, I would say, France, but what the MSB, which is an agency in Sweden, has been doing for the last couple of years. They're extremely good, and they're really an international model in terms of training civil servants. And also journalists. And when they do train journalists, they collaborate with an academic partner, and it can be, for example, a school of journalism. So the state is not in direct contact with the journalists, and then the freedom of expression and freedom of the press is protected through that intermediary. So I find it quite interesting, and Canada has been doing the same thing, working with McGill University. So training civil servants, training journalists. We should not train only kids, but also the adults. And the other part of the question was, sorry?
Beyond media literacy, should we be looking at increased regulation as a means to try to stop disinformation spreading?
Yeah, but it depends what kind of regulation, of course, and it's difficult to draw the line of what is acceptable in terms of also protecting freedom of expression, and also to make sure that the digital platforms are cooperating. Because if you expect things that are too illusory or naive, and they would not cooperate then. And we already have some difficulty working with the digital platforms. I understand that there is a good relationship with Facebook, but not with necessarily all the other platforms. And we see already that they are reluctant when we ask them to monitor certain areas, certain speeches, and to share information. It's more about the sharing of information. And so if we ask even more in terms of regulation, I think we'll have an issue with the cooperation of the platform. So yes, theoretically, it's good to regulate more, but it's the devil is the devil is in the details, and so we should be discussing more precisely what kind of regulations. And we've had in the past years an attempt called the Avia Law of regulating more radically the various hate speech and disinformation online, and it failed. It was blocked, actually. It did not pass. So you see that the protection of the freedom of the press and freedom of expression is really strong in France, and any attempt to regulate really is countered by a mobilization from the civil society and from the Senate and the National Assembly most of the time.
Thanks. Just out of curiosity, and I think I'll put this to all the panelists, if you were to be able to access data from social media companies that you currently cannot access, what would it be? What would be on your wish list, and what would you do with it? Jean-Baptiste, would you like to tackle that?
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
Sorry, the question is, and I'm going to put this to all of the panelists, if you could access data that you currently cannot from the digital platforms, what kind of data would you like to have access to, and what research would you do with it?
Well, I would personally ask, and I was discussing this with one of my friends recently, and we would ask the same thing, the archives from the Macron leaks operation in 2017, because there were rumors of massive manipulations, fake accounts, bots, and so on. But at the time, the platforms did not communicate on such accounts. They did suppress many accounts, but we don't know for what reasons exactly and what those accounts were actually doing. So if they archived the behavior, the supposedly inauthentic behavior of those accounts, it would be great to have access to those archives and to be able to dig deeply in what happened in 2017, to also be better able to anticipate what could happen in 2022. So I would ask specific access to archived, deleted accounts, specifically on Facebook and Twitter, dating back from 2017.
Excellent. Kate, what kind of data would you like to have that you currently can't, and what would you do with it?
This is such a hard question, because I understand why I don't have a lot of that data due to privacy concerns. And we've done almost all of our research on publicly available data. But as we see sort of a trend, this is already happening in a lot of other contexts. But in the US, we were kind of, a lot of the focus was on very public platforms. And now there's a trend towards smaller, more private platforms, places like Telegram and WhatsApp, and places where content is a little bit less visible. And not to say that I want access to that, but I will say that's increasingly important part of the picture of what's going on. And it's the behaviors are happening in places that we can't see as well. And what would it mean to be able to access some of that data? I think in some ways that we just never will be able to, because it's going to be private. And so we'll have to do other kinds of, use other kinds of techniques, interviews, talking to people, having them showing us their content and their environment to better understand how they're how they're experiencing and being exposed to mis and disinformation. Content where people opt in to let researchers have access to their feeds. I think increasingly those kinds of techniques are going to be even more important than the kind of data analysis we've been doing for years, which is through the public data, because I think a lot of the activity is just not going to be there.
Paulo, what kind of data would you like to have?
Eu, como a Kate, também não faço questão nenhuma de acessar dados das empresas de plataforma, mas eu acho que os dados fundamentais para a gente conseguir mudar a situação de domínio, né, de concentração e de monopólio, seriam dados relativos aos segredos industriais, de transparência algorítmica, tecnológica e de transparência econômica. Eu acho que esses dois eixos, a economia e a tecnologia, são os eixos que colocam essas plataformas num superpoder de manipulação, tanto econômica quanto política, e de concentração do debate público. Então, acho que esses dois elementos, informações sobre desde do financiamento, como se dá o processo de feeds, de recomendações, etc., que tem a ver um pouco com os processos de desenhos algorítmicos, até os processos de transparência econômica também, quem são os financiadores, etc. Eu acho que essas são as questões chaves e estruturais assim, para a gente entender um pouco do papel das grandes plataformas hoje dentro das democracias ocidentais.
We have such huge gaps between the lack of transparency reporting that's consistent over time and actual data sharing to be able to do deeper things like measurements. Will, what would be on your wish list to have?
Yeah, so I have a background as a scientist in human behavior, which for that reason, I think the thing that I'm most interested in is what is the effect of these interventions, right? We've seen Facebook and Twitter do all these things to do labeling. We see, Twitter during the election added friction with measures to their retweeting interface to make it so you had to add additional context. And, they did all these things, and there was lots of controversy about these things, right? Like, do these things impact freedom of expression, labeling or suppressing a narrative? But, we really don't know how well these things work. There are sort of scattered blog posts saying, well, we did this thing and it reduced retweeting by X%. How do we know that they know that, right? It's very hard to know the effect of these interventions. You have to do controlled experiments. No one is in a position to do that except the platforms. But to Kate's point, we're getting to a point where more and more content, the content itself is not accessible even by the platforms. So the effect of those kinds of interventions where you analyze a piece of content or a narrative in order to intervene, those interventions might be diminishing in their importance as people are moving to more private encrypted platforms, which we think should exist and should be available for people to use for a lot of very important reasons. But for platforms that are public or semi-public, in the case of Facebook, we think that having more information on that kind of stuff it's absolutely necessary if we're going to know how to address the problem. We have to have eyes on the problem. We have to be able to measure our interventions in order to understand how to address it.
I think we have time for maybe just one more question, and we'll take this one from Nicholas B. Beyond local and national initiatives, are there any actual examples or attempts of international cooperation on these topics, particularly between governments? And what would be the main challenges for it to be feasible? I don't know, Will or Kate, you, Paulo?
Paulo, do you want to go?
Muito rapidamente, eu não conheço tratados internacionais que tratam especificamente de processos eleitorais de cooperação, mas existe, por exemplo, atualmente no Brasil, uma discussão sobre a adesão do Brasil à Convenção de Budapeste, que é uma convenção sobre cybercrimes. Então, eu acho que mais no sentido de cooperação internacional para entender qual é o tipo de articulação internacional que se faz dentro de sistemas cibernéticos. É uma pergunta muito interessante procurar saber se há do ponto de vista de manutenção das democracias, mas eu acho que especificamente em relação às tecnologias e às ameaças que ela tem, a gente teria que ver coisas como a Convenção de Budapeste, que já é válida na Europa.
Kate, are you aware of any? Oh, sorry, Will.
That's all right. Yeah, Kate.
It's outside of my, I'm not aware. Yeah, not outside of my area of expertise.
Yeah, and nothing comes to mind either. In the Summit for Democracy last week, many countries committed to protecting rights to freedom of expression in many different ways. I'm not sure how much attention was dedicated to disinformation or influence operations, but the State Department does want this to be a full year of action. So I would hope that there could be some commitments from countries to not actually traffic in disinformation either within their country or to other countries, and try to collaborate, especially for international influence operations, which, as we know, as we said before, the boundary between international and domestic influence operations not so clear.
Muito rapidamente, o Conselho Europeu tem algumas diretivas sobre voto e tecnologia, então voto eletrônico e voto pela internet. Então acho que o que mais se aproxima disso seriam acordos internacionais que possibilitam uma adequação para o uso da tecnologia em processos de eleição. Desculpa, Will, já te intrometer, mas é isso.
So there are some pockets. G7 and some of their friends are trying to collaborate to be able to do things that tends to happen more behind closed doors. Also with CDT, GNI, and several others, we've launched an action coalition around meaningful transparency, which is being funded by the Danish Foreign Ministry. So we are hoping governments will get involved in that as well. To that end, we are at time. Thank you to our great panelists, William T. Adler, Paulo José Lara, Jean-Baptiste Georges Villemin, and Kate Starbird. And thank you to the Center for Democracy and Technology and the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung for supporting this excellent piece of research and this panel. If you haven't read the report, A Lie Can Travel, Election Disinformation in the United States, Brazil, and France, I highly recommend it. There is a link in the chat. Otherwise, thank you very much all for joining us today.
Thank you.